Okay, everybody, I'm back. Third installment of the video here where I'm actually going to start drafting out the essay that I would write if I were in your shoes. Now, obviously, I've got some advantages here. I'm typing, I'm not stressed out, I'm not tired, at least not any more so than is typical. But it's my hope here that I can show you basically how my thought process would work with this kind of essay so that you can take something from it and hopefully apply that in the exam next week. So remember that there are two kinds of approaches that you can take when writing the essay. There's the sequential approach, or the chronological, whatever you care to call it, where you're basically just working through the piece from beginning to end. And you're making note of the way that the idea or the argument that the author is building changes, because very seldom do you see a piece that just has like this single-minded focus upon one single thing. Okay, the idea develops, it grows, he builds upon one piece and goes into other territory. You'll typically see a pattern of a pattern of organization as we go from like problem solution or cause effect or some other kind of form like that. And so you can explore that using the sequential approach. And you can just talk about all the different things that are happening that are rhetorically interesting that you think add to the punch of the message. You can also take the device-centered approach, where you focus every body paragraph on one single recurring technique. Now, they both have their strengths and weaknesses. There is no one like better form than another. It's really just what you're able to do given your reading of the passage. And I didn't talk a whole lot about that in the last video, but even though I was doing this all electronically, make sure that when you guys are working the prompt, not only are you marking up the prompt itself, looking for all those useful elements of SOAPs to help you get a sense of the situation before you read, but as you're reading the piece, mark it up. Okay, be placing yourself in the shoes of the intended audience. What moves do you see the author making, which are helping him or her to accomplish a specific goal, and what message is being built through those choices? Just as I was doing when I was picking apart the green piece, which I'll now write the essay for. So back to, our organizational approaches. Well, I don't see a whole lot of what you would call the handy-dandy devices or the easily labeled strategies here, or at least not enough of them or patterns of them that I would feel comfortable doing a device-centered approach. So I think instead I'm going to talk about this thing in sequence or in chronological order and just note the way that he builds this complex, nuanced message over the course of the entire speech. Okay, so I'll start with my introduction here. Remember, an introduction for an analysis essay should be pretty straightforward, okay? It should do two things. It should establish the context of the piece that you are analyzing. That means you mention the author or speaker, the situation he or she is responding to, the subject matter that is being discussed, and the audience that they're trying to reach. Once you've established that kind of baseline material, then you move into your thesis. You talk about the kinds of rhetorical tools you see being used, and you explain precisely what it is that they're being used to achieve. Okay, you state in as precise of terms as possible what is the goal that the author has in mind. Is he trying to persuade his audience to think a certain thing or to adopt a certain policy? Is she simply trying to cause the audience to look a little bit differently at something that they might have taken for granted? Is the author trying to build a vivid sense of a place or of a person? Is the author trying to evoke some sort of emotional response toward a subject? You know, there's a lot of different things you can say about purpose here. It just so happens that for this particular prompt, it's pretty straightforward and it's pretty clearly laid out for me in the prompt itself. So let's start. I might begin building the context here with something kind of like this. At the onset of the Civil War, here's my classic, Wheeler typing skills at work. And I'll just kind of like elaborate the conflict which would decide the fates of millions. I want to establish that this was an enormously important historical moment. Alfred M. Greene, that's our speaker, spoke in hopes of, what was his goal or what was the subject matter? Well, he's trying to motivate of motivating his fellow I'm going to avoid just like the bulky PC term here. I'm just going to say his fellow free blacks to strive for the right to serve the Union's cause. And that's how he sees it. This should be a right that we should have to be able to participate in this epic conflict, which will decide the fates of so many. Okay, so springing into my thesis, knowing the supreme importance of the moment. Not Breen, I'll say he skillfully uses a variety of methods, because I don't see like any easily listed off patterns of technique. He uses a variety of methods to inspire Northern blacks to, what is it that he wants them to do? To rise to the occasion and take up arms to defeat the Confederacy. That's the ultimate goal here. And there's a lot of different things that I can explore that he's using to accomplish it. So, as you can see here, guys, a pretty straightforward kind of introduction. Yours should be the same, okay? Build a sense of the context, show that you have an awareness of the situation surrounding this piece of writing, okay? The little triangle here of the speaker, the message, and the audience. And then state exactly what it is that the author is trying to accomplish using certain rhetorical devices or tools. All right, I'll go into my first body paragraph. So again, I'm not focused on devices. I'm just going to say that, this first section of the piece, and maybe it's, they're not so easily separated into like, hey, this is where one section begins and ends. But I think I can kind of talk like largely about this chunk right here. You'll notice I'm highlighting this piece of the passage because I think that this section of the speech, I can say that largely it's about him establishing a sense of patriotic duty, which is a pretty important thing to do early on, is to make your audience feel as though the subject matter you're going to talk about is relevant to them, and that they should be duty-bound to listen and to partake in what you're asking them to do. So I'll open up my my first body paragraph here saying something like, Green's speech opens with a number of appeals to the patriotism of his audience and hopes of capturing their immediate support in his message, or for his message. Okay, so I'm just basically establishing this is the tempo that he builds in the very beginning. This is a kind of strategy that I'm seeing him use pretty frequently throughout the beginning chunk of the piece, and this is kind of what this section of the speech is intended to do. It's supposed to build immediate support and get them to, turn an ear towards the rest of the message. So I'll move into my first example. In his very first sentence, Green refers to America as the Great Republic. Notice that I'm incorporating this one little snippet of quotation here, and I go beyond simply saying, Green says. Okay, I make sure that the context of the quotation is clear, that I'm talking about this interesting diction choice that he made. So I want to set it up by mentioning the author's name, saying that he makes a very particular choice, and I'm trying to be very careful about the verbs I'm choosing so that I don't just say the author says, the author says, the author says. So the author refers to America as the Great Republic. And that's all the little piece of quotation that I need here because I'm just looking at that diction choice. And then I'm going to say this is a term which evokes pride and suggests that the coming war is to determine the fate of not just a nation, but a grand experiment worth fighting to preserve. So if you're like, well, Wheeler, what are you talking about here? Well, I'm thinking about the term, the Republic, and I'm playing the little head game here of why this and not that. Why the Republic rather than America? Well, calling it the Republic is evoking this sense of the great experiment of what America is supposed to be. It's not just like this political label, but it's this grand kind of philosophical thing that the country is supposed to stand for. Okay? We're not just like a set of little territories that are bound together with some common rules. We share this kind of common ideal of being the Republic. So it's a way of showing that the thing that they're fighting for is very, very significant and worth fighting for, and that the stakes are pretty high. Okay, so moving forward here, the next thing that I want to talk about, he also lists the cornerstones of the nation's character. And in his words, he says, love of country, of freedom, and of civil and religious toleration. Yeah, I'll end my sentence right there. And let's go into the so what. So what is the purpose behind this? Remember, your job is always to be explaining the intended impact upon the audience's thinking or feelings, and how this is pulling them a little bit closer to accepting his message, how this is helping him to be more persuasive. Okay? In order to answer that question, guys, how is it helping him be more persuasive? You've always got to talk about what it's going to do to the audience. So I might say here that by mentioning those things, by listing them off, by reminding his audience of what is at stake in this war, okay, all these like wonderful qualities that are kind of woven into the American character. These are the things that are at risk of being lost forever. By reminding of his audiences what is at stake, he incites a more powerful desire in them, in his audience, to contribute their efforts. So this is why I feel like he's listing those things off, because it's a good way of making them feel as though something is on the line. Here are all the great things that are potentially going to be lost, or the things that we are fighting for. Okay, those are things that a reasonable person or a person with patriotic pride would want to fight for. Okay, moving forward here. That's one more thing that I can talk about, because I don't want this paragraph to get like out of control. So I'll say finally, I'm going to go to like the references here to Washington and the Founding Fathers and some of the things that they did, the sacrifices that they made. So I'll say finally, he alludes, that's what he's doing, he's making an allusion. He alludes to, let's just incorporate this little piece, the immortal Washington. I'm going to mention here, contextually why this is important. He's a universally beloved figure of the time, and the democratic ideals that he and others so dearly bought. Okay, I remember talking about that phrase earlier here. I thought that was interesting that he was saying that the things that Americans have been fighting for were dearly bought by the Founding Fathers. They were so dearly bought during the Revolution. Reminding his audience of those sacrifices, because that's what they were. They're big sacrifices that Washington and others made, emphasizes the obligation they have to fight for the same values, once again, under threat. Time's about to be up on this video, guys, so I think I'm going to pause here, and what I'll do is write the rest of the essay, post the entire thing for you to watch, but hopefully this was of some use to you going forward.